Welcome to Washington Policy on the Go. My name is David Bose. I'm the Communications Director for Washington Policy Center. Every week, we bring to you our center directors to talk about the latest of what's happening in Olympia, what's happening in state policy. And then outside the legislative session, we come to you every other week and bring you the same information about what's happening in state policy, new research or discoveries that we've made in terms of how state policy is manifesting itself, and proposed changes. And all the information you need to keep track of what's happening with Olympia and how it affects your life. We hope that you share the content that you learn here with friends and family and on your social media pages as well. At the end of each video, we post it or each episode rather, we post it on our YouTube channel so you can catch up with it there as well. Today, we're going to focus on transportation because there's a big hearing in Olympia on income taxes today. And we want to run through one issue and then allow people a chance to watch that and participate in that if they have the time. I'll share a link to that, to where you can find that video here in a few moments in the chat as well, so you can get to that on your own. We're joined today by Charles Prestrud. He is our Transportation Director at Washington Policy Center. Charles, transportation usually kind of manifests itself toward the end of the session because of the transportation budgets and things like that. What have you found? What's happening right now in Olympia? What's happening in the legislature regarding transportation, and how have things changed since the last time we talked?
Okay. Well, we're 50 days into a 60-day session, so things are definitely coming into focus. Yesterday was the cutoff for transportation bills, and the House and Senate have each passed transportation budgets, which will now go to reconciliation. And, if you look at the top line numbers, they're not that far apart. The Senate budget is $14.6 billion for the biennium. The House budget is $14.3 billion for the biennium. You would think that would be pretty easy to reconcile through a negotiation. But when we dig into the details a little, we can see there are some significant differences between how they went about this. For instance, for completion of the SR 520 project, bids came in about $500 million over budget. That was news from late last year. So the House budget directs the Department of Transportation to reject that bid and to revise the proposal so it would only rebuild the westbound lanes from Montlake up to I-5. This defers the eastbound lanes and the lid at the Roanoke interchange. That may not be happy. That may not make some people very happy. In contrast, the Senate budget increases the budget for the project, and it defers over $100 million in sales tax and adds tolling to the segment between Montlake and I-5 in order to cover the much higher cost. These approaches are so different. There's no easy way to compromise. They're going to have to do it one way or the other. And I don't know how that's going to work out.
I thought they've been working on. I feel like they've been working on that particular project. I feel like it's been decades that has been talked about. Am I off there, or is this?
No. Let me think here. I think the Department of Transportation entered into the Urban Partnership Project with the Federal Highway Administration and King County Metro back in, it was about 2008, something like that. So yeah, it's, we're looking at 15 or 16 years, but it was a big, complicated project done in phases. I'm afraid that's just the nature of the work, especially when you're working in an environmentally sensitive area that goes right through residential neighborhoods, goes over water. So not a project that could be done quickly.
Okay, sorry for interrupting. So we have this project where it seems like, hey, they're pretty close on the budget line in terms of dollars, but not even anywhere near close in terms of how that money would be spent or the nature of how the project would proceed. So that means there's going to be some pretty big negotiations going on that project alone. What else do you have in that area for us?
Well, another example of how the House and Senate are looking at things a little bit differently. The 520 project wasn't the only one that had a big cost overrun. And in reaction to the bids coming in way over the estimates, the Senate budget directs the Department of Transportation to convene an expert panel to review the procurement methods. The idea is to see if the Department of Transportation can bring down project costs by breaking big projects into smaller pieces that might attract more competitive bids, or to combine design with construction, or other ways of making the process more competitive. This isn't really a new thing, and it's not a bad thing, not a bad question to ask either. But the Department of Transportation has been looking at different ways they can package work, different ways they can share risk, different ways they can go through the contracting process in order to better match the procurement process with the particular project that they're doing. So I wouldn't expect any miracle solutions to come out of this expert review if that's what they finally decide to do. The real problems, the bigger problems that the Department of Transportation is facing that has been driving up the cost and making it hard for the legislature to come up with a budget is overall inflation, shortage of skilled labor, and a very unfavorable bid climate because of the huge amount of large civil engineering projects that are in the works around the region and around the state. You've got Sound Transit doing their ST2 and ST3 programs, tens of billions of dollars. The Department of Transportation is building out the Move Ahead Washington and Connecting Washington packages that the legislature previously passed. So there's just an enormous amount of work to be done and a limited number of contractors and consultants to do the work. And so they get very choosy, and when they bid, it tends to be on the high side.
So this is yet another reason why my feelings about Sound Transit have soured even more. It's not only is it costing a lot of money and not going to pay off in any by any metric I can find, but it's competing against itself, or basically cannibalizing key people needed for these projects, and driving up the costs, I'm guessing, too, because of demand. So
that's certainly true, and we've seen this now for the last dozen years at least. Sound Transit now has a very large staff. Many of them were hired away from local agencies that now find themselves shorthanded. And Sound Transit, they pay top dollar for their contractors and consultants, which makes it hard, especially for smaller jurisdictions that don't have big budgets, don't have big tax base. They put projects out to bid. They get very few bids, and the ones they get are at very high prices. So this is a significant problem that's driving up costs, not just for Sound Transit, but for public agencies all over the region.
I can certainly see how that would stack up onto itself. And then, and then also in terms of some of the budget limitations that you're talking about already for these transportation projects, if we're moving billions of dollars into other fancier, newer, more exciting looking, Sound Transit train projects, that means those dollars can't be used for the basic highway structure that's actually moving people and goods and services and all of that.
This is true. I mean, there is some limit on how much you can tax people for transportation and all other government functions. Admittedly, in some parts of the region, Seattle in particular, there seems to be a much greater willingness for people to tax themselves. But as we've discussed, this does have some downstream effects on how much it costs to get things done.
Yeah, and even the willingness to tax themselves, if people operate under certain promises. Like if you talk with people, generally they'll think, "Hey, when Sound Transit's there, I won't have to. There won't be the congestion problem. People are going to be able to move." And a lot of times they haven't really looked into. There's not a real critical media examining these figures and saying, "Okay, well, what does the data say? Would people be able to, move about and change jobs and switch based on these tracks, or would movement on these stationary platforms make it more difficult for people to switch jobs and change over time?" And and will it actually reduce congestion and so forth. So some of that stuff I look at it and I think they're voting for something that they think they're going to get, but they're not necessarily going to get. What about the east side of the mountains, particularly the Spokane North-South Freeway? Is there any particular news about those funds in what you've seen so far?
The North-South Freeway is one of the state DOT projects that would have this expert review panel look at whether the contract can be done in a way that lowers the cost. I don't remember just offhand what the House budget has for that. That project, as you know, in the past has been one that not everyone in the legislature was a big fan of. The House budget does direct the Department of Transportation to conduct a cost evaluation process this year. So we'll see.
Interesting. And well, I'm sure we'll be following that pretty closely. What about non-budget related transportation bills? I mean, I know the budget's a big deal, and we'll talk more about it. But were there any other non-budget transportation policy packages or bills that grabbed your attention?
Because this was a short session, and because they were so focused on the budget, there weren't nearly as many transportation bills this session as we've seen in the past. But there were a few that were kind of interesting, for better or worse in some cases. For instance, Senate Bill 6304, which was about electrification of the transportation system. And it included a whole bunch of different things, more charging stations and Department of Commerce, and whoever drafted the bill also squeezed in a couple of other interesting provisions. One was a requirement for new tires to meet low rolling resistance standards. And the intent of this was to make cars a little bit more energy efficient by requiring tires that roll more easily. Sounds reasonable. The invention of the wheel is not a new thing, but it turns out, as you know, there are hundreds and hundreds of different kinds of tires, different widths, different tread types. There's season tires, there's off-road tires, and so it turns out that there aren't tires in all the sizes that people would want that would meet this new rolling resistance standard. And so there was strong pushback on this from Les Schwab and some of the other tire dealers saying, hey, wait a minute, we don't have tires in all the sizes that are even going to meet this standard. And if you impose it, people are just going to go to Oregon and Idaho and buy their tires anyway. So that bill, which, by the way, also included a restriction on truck idling, which made it very unpopular with the truckers and some of the retailers. That bill, I believe, did not make it out of committee, which is interesting, or it didn't advance. That's what happened. So
you might say it didn't roll. That's just the reason I was laughing is just the hubris involved, where you're trying to pass a bill to tell people how to build a tire, and I mean I would just never do that. I'd look at that and go, you know what? I'm not really an expert in the tire area. There's a lot of them out there. There's different traction needs depending on where you live. Some parts of our state are pretty difficult and rugged terrain and so forth. So I just find it funny that somebody's trying, so that people thought it was a good idea. I don't know where it came from, but I can kind of picture a committee of people just looking around thinking, I think I've really got something here, and not thinking it through.
Yes. And one of our commenters has just pointed out that the new tires might wear out faster. Is probably true.
Yeah, I see that. Yeah.
So another bill was Senate Bill 6277, and this is one that developed new statutory language for the state's public-private partnership laws, designed to make it easier for the Department of Transportation in particular to enter into partnerships with private entities to finance and get built various projects. This is not a new idea either. The state already has a public-private partnership law. They've attempted to use it in the past, but it turns out to be trickier than you might think, in part because public agencies often, well, always, have very different objectives than private partners. They have different time horizons, and they have a whole different set of priorities. These things are not easily negotiated. So that bill, even though it passed out of the Senate on a 48-1 vote, so a lot of support in the Senate, but I don't believe it made it through the committee in the House. I will not be at all surprised if we see that one again in the future, given its popularity in the Senate.
No, it's interesting that we haven't talked about road maintenance when there's so much talk. I mean, you know, we had the infamous what they called a pothole, but it was like a giant pit, off the West Seattle Bridge that would surely be death if anyone stepped into it, and what might mean a new car for anyone who drove into it. And that kind of reignited talk. What was that? A year ago, 2 years ago? And so I'm curious, was there anything that caught your attention regarding a new emphasis on trying to catch up with the backlog of maintenance, highway maintenance, that is plaguing the state and bridge repair?
There is. Due to some budget machinations last year, the funding for highway preservation and maintenance that had previously been programmed for 2024, that's work that would mostly be done this coming summer, got taken out. And when the Asphalt Paving Association and the general contractors and the Good Roads and Transportation Association and the Association of Washington Business found out about this, they said, hey, wait a minute, we can't afford to lose another construction season. We already have too big a backlog. So there was a lot of push in Olympia for the legislature to find some money to at least do the repaving and maintenance projects for 2024 that were ready to go. As you and I have talked about before, the Department of Transportation estimates that they need close to $1 billion per year above the existing funding level to get caught up. And even at that rate, it would take them more than a decade to bring the system up to a state of good repair. So in both the House and the Senate budgets, they include a little money for highway preservation and maintenance, but it's not nearly enough. I think one of them is 100 million and the other one's less than that. So yeah, the Senate is 100 million for highway preservation, and I think the House is about the same amount. So what this means is that highway pavement condition is actually going to deteriorate more over the next year. We're going to be falling farther behind, and they're going to have a bigger hole to fill, so to speak, in future years.
And doesn't that also mean that the maintenance backlog gets more expensive? Because you've pointed out in the past that in some cases, obviously not everywhere instantly, but the longer you put off the maintenance, the more expensive it becomes.
Yes, these projects will get more expensive. They also may get more extensive because when pavement deteriorates beyond a certain point, you have to reconstruct the whole highway. You can't just fill the potholes and call it good. And the full reconstruction is a much more expensive and time-consuming process.
Yeah, and disruptive for commerce and everybody
Yes.
traveling as well. So yeah, expensive in more than one way. There's a question from Jody, wants to know what happened to the $6 billion surplus. I think that's a question about the overall revenue being brought into the state. But
yes, the state's total revenues had a significant surplus. I don't remember what the exact number was, but it was in the billions of dollars. Unfortunately, neither the governor nor the legislature seemed to like the idea of applying much of that surplus to the deficit in the transportation budget. So that's all I can tell you about that.
It's kind of like if you have a leaky roof and you got a bucket of that tar from Home Depot and you poured it on there and you patched up your roof a little bit. And then the next year you get, you've got a $30,000 surplus and you're thinking, I could get that roof, but there's so many other things that I want,
Yeah.
and you just think, I wonder how long this tar will hold, and that's kind of what our state's doing with the transportation infrastructure, which is necessary to just about everything else that we want to accomplish in the state, one
Yep.
way or the other. So that's a challenge. There's a question that's come in. It's kind of off topic, but it's interesting. Why is the Department of Transportation spending millions on right-of-way cleaning, landscaping to top tent cities, and boulder placement when they could just make it illegal and fine the trespasser? Although I'm not sure those that are doing that kind of trespassing are going to be all that concerned about paying their fines. But
Well, that's a good question, and there are a couple of things to be said about it. One is it does cost the Department of Transportation a lot of money to do all that cleanup, and it does take away their maintenance people from other tasks, repairing guardrails and fences and filling potholes and all of the other things that their maintenance crews do. Part of the reason it is such a problem is that the Department of Transportation, even though it's responsible for maintaining state rights of way, it does not have enforcement capability. That authority is vested in law enforcement, state patrol, or local police. And there's been this kind of back and forth between the Department of Transportation and local police departments about whose job it is to go enforce the existing laws that prohibit camping on freeway rights of way. So, the governor has asked for significant funding to help pay for more of this. We'll just have to see where it goes. But the problem certainly has not gone away. It's gotten moved around quite a bit. And it's been diminished a little bit because they do try and move the campers into some kind of permanent housing. But as anyone who's driven up and down I-5 can tell you, the problem has not been eliminated, not by a long shot.
Yeah, that problem seems to be getting steeper in the Tacoma area. I'll tell you that right now. What about other things that are kicked down the road? I mean, you mentioned that we've got other projects that they're trying to defer. We've got maintenance they're trying to defer. There's a lot of things it sounds like that are getting kicked for another session. Does this? Are you already making predictions about the 2025 session based on what you're seeing in this one?
Well, I can tell you about a couple of other big issues that weren't really addressed in any permanent way in this session. One is funding for the ferry system. There were two bills introduced, one of which called for a study of the ferry system's finances. We talked about that last week. And the other was a bill that called on the governor to declare a ferry system emergency and immediately contract for 2 clean diesel ferries. Neither of those bills advanced. I believe the House budget, transportation budget, does include funding for a study of the ferry system's finances. We'll see if that makes it through the reconciliation process.
I'm always skeptical about a study, another study to look at. So it's like, having your checkbook out of balance and you're like, you know what, we could either fix this or let's commission a study and figure out what's, why this thing's in the red.
So the ferry system, as we know, is already facing a multi-billion-dollar budget gap for their capital needs, and their operating costs continue to rise. Those are longer term issues which are not addressed in either the House or Senate budget this time around.
Yeah, and neither has been the mandate for the electrification of the ferries, even though you and others have pointed out that, hey, this is a very expensive way to go for a theoretical environmental benefit, and not a big one at that. So there's a huge amount of money and resources and delay, which is costing in other ways as well. and inconvenience to people who are, I mean, say what you will about the ferries, they're part of the guaranteed state highway system, so they should be operational, and they're not. And so when I see that they don't take care of the low-hanging fruit, like, hey, this is something that's extra expensive, we wanted it over here, it turns out we can't afford it. There's no movement there that I've seen, and that just does not smack of seriousness about the budget challenges that you're outlining. That maybe they're not present right now, but they will be soon, as things, chickens come home to roost, so to speak.
Yeah, the situation is not going to improve over the next 10 months. So this is definitely going to be on the legislature's to-do list for 2025. Another big issue that they need to deal with is the court order requiring removing culverts and barriers to fish passage. And this is one area where the House and Senate budgets are in agreement. They both set aside $150 million for that work. The problem is the Department of Transportation's most recent estimate says you've got a $4 billion budget gap. So $150 million is not going to get us very far. I mean, it's better than nothing. And I'm sure the department will let's hope they put it to good use in the coming year. But there's a much bigger budget gap that the department will need to address.
Yeah, that's insane. Now, Charles, I take it that we'll get a legislative wrap up from you when the session closes, and you'll have more insight on what actually ends up happening with these budgets and the discrepancies and the negotiations that are going on right now. But I do want to thank you for your time today, as always, insightful and interesting to me about what's happening in our transportation sector. Any final observations you want to make to people before we close it up?
I think I've shared enough bad news for one meeting, but we'll look forward to the post-session wrap up in another week or two.
Awesome. Thanks, Charles. For everybody else, TVW will be broadcasting the hearing today on income taxes. I just put a link up so that you can view that. We're going to close a little bit early today so people can watch that hearing as it goes on right now, I believe. So you'll be able to view that hearing and participate in that as well. All right. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll be back next week with another episode of Washington Policy on the Go. Charles Prestrud, thank you. And thank you to each of you for tuning in today.
Thank you, David.